If we would look at the map of the Roman Empire in AD 562, shortly after the Ostrogothic kingdom had been defeated once and for all, and all remaining barbarian strongholds in Italy had been subjugated, we would get the impression that Justinian had been successful in restoring much of the former Roman Empire. It would seem as if the glory of Rome indeed had almost been restored, and that the Mediterranean would once again be called Mare Nostrum. But we shall see during the course of this video that nothing could be further from the truth, and the war that should have restored the glory of Rome in fact ended everything that was left of this glory. Maps can fool us. We look at maps and territories and are impressed by the size of empires, of kingdoms, of countries. And so it is the case with all maps of the Roman Empire, from its beginnings until its very end. But maps only tell one part of the story, the sheer territory that was controlled by the Roman Empire. However, they do not tell the story of how daily life was in the Roman Empire of respective times in different parts. And so, when we look at the Roman Empire of AD 562, we are fooled to believe that everything was well again, that the flame of Rome was burning brightly again. But while the Vandalic War was a quick victory of the Eastern Romans, and that kingdom fell without harm for the local population, the Gothic War was unfortunately a giant disaster for the inhabitants of the Italian peninsula. In the more than 25 years of constant warfare, from Belisarius' landing in Sicily in 535 until the last Gothic, Alemanni and Frankish strongholds were defeated in 562, in those 27 years, Rome had been captured and besieged many times. Captured by Belisarius in 536, a long siege in 537 under Witiges, a long siege and sack in 546 by Totila, recaptured again in 547 by Belisarius, besieged again and captured in 549 by Totila, and recaptured a final time in 551 by Narses. We can imagine the disastrous effect this had on the city of Rome itself and on the population. According to different estimates, the city had between 100 and possibly even up to 200,000 inhabitants shortly before the outbreak of the Gothic War in 535. After 551, this number was probably as low as 30,000. Many statues had been destroyed when they were thrown down onto the Goths during the first siege of Witiges. The walls of Aurelian were torn down by Totila in 546. They were restored to some degree by Belisarius, but only hastily and certainly not in a perfect manner. The monuments of Rome, which had been kept in repair by the urban prefects in the kingdom of Theodoric, were not maintained anymore. There was no more money for restoration projects of any kind. Under Theodoric, the palace on the Palatine Hill, for example, was repaired by revenue from the wine tax. Archaeological evidence shows that many monuments were being kept in repair until the outbreak of the war. All the aqueducts and the large baths were still functioning in 536. But the aqueducts were cut in the siege of 537 by the Goths and were never fully repaired again. Most of the ancient magnificent baths would thus cease to function. The baths of Trajan, of Decius, of Constantine, of Diocletian, of Caracalla, empty, barren, desolate, where in 536 they still had been full of life. 20 years later, they would be empty halls where vines would start to overgrow everything. And while the Ostrogoths had paradoxically taken great care to preserve the monuments as best as they could, the new masters, the so-called Romans from the East, would, as it turned out, not be as motivated in restoring and repairing the old monuments. In fact, almost no repairs are being recorded from 551 onwards, when the eunuch Narses took up residence in the old palace on the Palatine Hill. And please like this video and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting our work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. YouTube is really not generous to such a niche topic about the late Roman Empire, and the ad revenue from the videos is really brutally low. So in order to be long-term sustainable, I unfortunately need your financial support via Patreon or YouTube membership, as embarrassed as I am to say this. I think Maiorian would thank you for supporting a channel bearing his name. I certainly do thank you from the bottom of my heart. Gratias agutibi amici. In fact, only 2 bridges have been attested to have been repaired under Narses. The Eastern Romans would show little respect for their ancestral city, from whence their predecessors had set out to create the Imperium Romanum. Apparently even the contrary seemed to be the case, and in 571 we are told Narses plundered some statues from the old temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, which had stood without roof, empty, barren and desolate since the Vandal sack of 455. Apart from the restoration of the aforementioned 2 bridges, only one further repair apparently had been carried out, namely on the Aurelian walls. But as for new building activity, only the construction of some churches has been recorded from the time when Narses resided in Rome in the years after his victory over the Goths. But it appears that Narses had been extremely harsh on the people of Rome and taxed them to the brink. He was therefore extremely unpopular with the last remaining inhabitants of the Eternal City, and the older Romans were now fondly thinking back to the benevolent and mild rule which they had enjoyed in the Ostrogothic kingdom, compared to the yoke under the new masters from the Eastern Roman Empire. This was the first break between West and East, and an opportunity that had been easily given away by Narses. Instead of unifying the old Western people and the East, Narses, with his harsh policy, would already initiate the alienation between West and East, which would later lead to the schism and the subsequent hatred of the West towards the rulers in Constantinople. Not one single monument, not a single temple, column, or old imperial building is recorded to have been restored by the Eastern Romans. Most of the old Senate had been captured or killed after Totila's sack of the city in 546. Even though there were some tries to restore this ancient order, it never again regained its former status, and by 600 it would disappear completely. There was also no urban prefect anymore that could organize the restoration and repair of the city. Consuls were not elected in the West anymore, the last one having held office only shortly before the outbreak of the war. There are almost no literary works left from that time. There was none of the caliber of Cassiodorus or Boetius or Symmachus that had written in the style of the old Romans just a few decades earlier. Now the utterly reduced population would slowly start to settle down at the banks of the Tiber, at the old Forum Boarium and the Campus Martius, whereas the outlying parts of the city had been by now completely abandoned. Every time an earthquake would hit the city, the monuments were not repaired anymore, but the fallen columns used as new building material. The desolation was now beginning to spread ever faster, and it appears that Justinian did nothing against this growing desolation. He showed little interest in restoring Rome itself to its old former glory. Thus began the decay of Rome to accelerate more and more. We can therefore say that it was the Gothic Wars that really caused the fall of the city of Rome. Any semblance of old imperial glory that might still have been visible in places during the reign of the Ostrogoths would now completely vanish. Buildings would crumble left and right, buildings overgrown by vines and plants. nature was reconquering the outer lying parts of the city, and when the Tiber had a flood, the floor level would rise due to the residue left by the retreating river after the flood, so that the ground level would slowly start to rise. And all the old institutions apart from the Senate were also completely gone, with the church being the only institution left. But not only in Rome, but in the whole of Italy. Gone was also the advanced Roman law, and the Roman libraries and schools. The 27 years of war had desolated the Campania. The cut aqueducts would flood parts of the surrounding lands of Rome, transforming them into wet marshlands where diseases would spread quickly in the humidity. Mediolanum had been razed by the Burgundians in 539, over 10,000 people killed. The city was empty, barren, and desolate. It must have been a sight similar to Rome. Trade had collapsed. Cities could now only maintain a much smaller population. Peasants started planting crops in the decaying ruins of the old grandiose monuments of their ancestors, wondering how splendorous the old times must have been. Everything that had been left of the old Western Roman Empire was utterly destroyed in the Gothic Wars. The flame of Roma, that was already weak but still burned in 530, was now fully extinct. But worse, the empire had overstretched itself. The event of 536 and the plague of 541 onwards had weakened the empire and killed many people. And thus already in 568, only an incredibly short 6 years after the full pacification of Italy, would the Lombards descend into the peninsula. And this time, the Romans had nothing left to counter, since the eternal enemy in the east, the Persians, were always waiting for the Roman Empire to show weakness. Half of the territory of Italy was lost to the Lombards, fracturing the peninsula. And this fracturing of Italy was so total and complete that it would take 1300 years until Italy was finally unified again in the 19th century. Some decades after the Lombard invasion of Italy, Slavs overran the Balkans. A disastrous war with Persia erupted that would last from 602 until 628, which depleted anything that the Romans still had, also severely weakening Persia, so that only shortly later the Arabs would have easy game in overrunning large parts of the Eastern Roman Empire. It can thus be said that this war that Justinian had started in order to restore the glory of Rome had in fact destroyed everything that was left of the old Western Roman Empire, and had possibly even hastened the demise of the Roman Empire in general. Now, of course, I admit this is unfair because we are applying hindsight. Had the anomalous climatic event of 536 not happened, and had the plague of 542 not happened, it is quite possible that the Roman Empire could have been restored. Certainly if Belisarius would have received more support from Justinian. The Vandal kingdom was conquered by 534, the Ostrogothic kingdom by 540. Belisarius might have achieved to reconquer Hispania from the Visigoths by 550, and maybe even the Frankish kingdom by 560. But in our timeline, the famines following 536 did happen, and the plague that probably killed more than 10% of the empire's population did happen after 541, and so we can say that while the idea of Justinian to restore the Roman Empire might have been, from his viewpoint, a grandiose one, the reality was that it turned out to be a very bad one. The glory of Rome was not restored, but it was destroyed once and for all, never to resurface again in its old form, but only transformed 1,000 years later when the Renaissance came. Such, dear friends of late Roman history, is often the irony of history. And if you are interested in how Rome looked shortly before the Gothic Wars, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner. But if you're more interested in the Gothic War itself, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias amici Imperii Romani, and bene valete.